Thanks, Adam, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our session, which is covering the upcoming legal and regulatory pitfalls and hurdles. And our focus, of course, will be on those issues that impact decentralized systems in particular. Just a little bit more fulsome introduction of our panelists. We have Marc Boiron, partner at FisherBroyles, Rebecca Rettig, also a partner at FisherBroyles, Jason Somensatto, Senior Counsel at 0x Labs, and Ksenia Sussman, Founder and CEO at LATTUDE. So an excellent lineup here. I'm Amy Kim with the Chamber of Digital Commerce, and I'll be moderating our session. So let's jump in. One of the biggest issues that I've seen at the Chamber is the characterization of tokens and the impact that that has on business models. So, for example, whether a token is a security or a commodity or a currency greatly impacts the ability of the token to be used within its ecosystem for its intended purpose, especially those that are running on decentralized protocols. We've had years of guidance and speeches and enforcement actions on this. So maybe, Rebecca, I'll turn to you first. How should we be thinking about decentralization from a legal perspective? And within that, which I think probably is crucial to this, is what does decentralized finance or decentralization really mean?
Sure. So actually, just capitalizing on what they said at the end of the last panel, I think of decentralized finance as digitizing legacy financial instruments and institutions and really bringing it into sort of a new age wealth management system for a much wider spectrum of users and individuals and entities than may be accepted and interacting in the legacy financial system. As far as decentralization, I'll say Marc and I work with a lot of DeFi projects and have for the last year and a half. So you should definitely jump in on this as well. But we think of decentralization as a spectrum and as a spectrum that actually requires time to go from the centralized process of building your protocol and putting together your project, launching it, and then really moving towards a more decentralized system. So I think, you have to think of this as this long spectrum. And when you get to a more centralized system, that you have a lot of different actors who are integrated into your protocol so that you really are making sure that that decentralization is sort of a full process.
And it sounds like what you're saying, it's you have to grow, right? You have to have that opportunity to grow and develop to get to that point. Marc, I'll turn to you. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think in reality, you can almost think about it as everyone who integrates in your protocol, or every company, every project, whatever it is, you could almost think of it as its own marketing branch for your protocol. And all that activity that a protocol needs to do upfront to generate interest in its protocol, bring people over to it, is suddenly something everyone who's integrated in it can essentially take over. You don't need to do that anymore. And that gets to the point where not only have you achieved the decentralization from a technical perspective, but now from a business perspective, your protocol can actually succeed. Unlike what we saw, I think, a lot in 2017, not everyone, but a lot, was this idea of we can automatically be decentralized and we're still going to have users who are just going to come to us. It doesn't happen.
Right. Right. Ksenia, I don't see your video. Are you with us?
Yeah, I am with you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. As I'm trying to figure out the video, I'm going to try to do that as we're in the middle of this. But yeah, do you mind just repeating the question?
Yeah, we're talking about, decentralization and really just kind of exploring what that means first before kind of getting into the legal regulatory pitfalls or triggers.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So from my perspective, I think what I'm seeing as in terms of decentralization is effectively taking away the sort of the middle person, the person in the middle, right? To the extent that I want to get anything done, whether I want to send a payment or enter sort of transaction, and why do I need that middle person? So I think that's what it is, and I think it is also comes down to sort of reliance on perhaps, and in our particular tech space, right, we're going to be super heavily reliant on the technology. So I think that not to put pressure on our awesome sort of technologists out there, but it is going to be very important to do it the right way in the beginning. So sort of to think through all the issues and all the possible hoops and loops that you need to jump through in order to develop that system that at the end of the day, you sort of trust that system, but you are in a full control of your own decisions. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And, Jason, how about you? I mean, kind of being inside that, that in the business side of things, how are you seeing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of what everybody said before. I think, from a practical perspective, 0x is a project that builds on top of Ethereum, right? And so for what is decentralization at a very practical perspective is when you deploy, a smart contract on chain, you are giving up some level of control over that interaction and giving it over to the people who are running the network and the code on Ethereum. And as Ksenia was saying, the reason you do that is kind of to take away a necessary middleman between the interactions of using that code. And so it's this weird thing of like decentralization very much is a concept of a lot of people networking and that kind of stuff, but it's also a very technical implementation from a practical perspective.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that, sorry, Rebecca.
No, I was just saying that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to eliminate that single point of failure, right? Like if you choose to be in or out, shouldn't impact the ongoing work of the community. And maybe that's a good place to talk about, the distinction between, a decentralized platform and decentralized protocols, and maybe the layers there, and how that can impact this kind of consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to distinguish between kind of the protocol and then whatever UI you might have that's on top of that. Those are two different issues. I think they bring about two different regulatory concerns. How you deal with them is going to be in two different ways. And then one of them is easier to get decentralized than the other. And so, really thinking through how to handle that is important. I think, on the protocol side of things, you really need to kind of get down to frankly, almost being honest with yourself. Like, is this actually decentralized? And it really comes down to there's this battle that I think most founders have internally on this disclosure related issue, which is it seems like there's a lot of desire not to disclose the fact that you still hold on to an admin key early on. Well, the reality is pretty much most projects are. And so the question is okay, well, what does that actually mean? And if you probably let users know that that's out there, I think that's better from a user perspective. But frankly, the fact is you are holding to the admin key. I think it's more defensible to say at least people knew that we were holding on to it than not. And then the UI, I just won't keep going on, and maybe Rebecca can jump in because we deal with this all the time together on kind of thinking about the UI. Yeah,
I was going to say, the other thing, just to build on the protocol point, and then I'll jump to the UI point, which is even if your protocol is decentralized, you've launched it, maybe you don't even hold the admin key, you can't make any changes to it. If you are still actively involved in somehow building around the protocol or making sure to build, these integrations that we were talking about before, and ensuring network effects, you also have to take that into account as you're moving forward and thinking about whether you're decentralized or not. So that's the point on the protocol. As far as the UI goes, and this goes to, your honesty too. If you have a UI that allows or facilitates access to the protocol, there come a lot of regulatory issues that surround the UI. Some of these UIs really do look like marketplaces, which has a lot of implications under the securities laws. And, you can decentralize your UI, but as Marc alluded to, it is much more technologically complex, and a lot of companies don't want to let go of it if they're associated with the UI. So that's a whole other regulatory hurdle that you have to really grapple with at a certain point in time when you're thinking about progressive decentralization.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I think there's, from a purely legal perspective, right, there's differences to why decentralization matters as compared to, from a business perspective. And like, I think probably for the listeners, what's important, you know, there's a bunch of different regimes, but like when we think about decentralization, right, why does it matter in some cases? Well, for example, with the 0x protocol, right, the importance of the protocol kind of being community governed, flexible, agnostic, you know, is the idea that people can use that for whatever purpose they want, right? It's not ours that we hold on to. And so therefore, if somebody wants to use it for trading a token, you know, that has some implication from a regulatory perspective, you know, that's kind of their independent decision. Whereas when we build a UI on it, so for 0x, we have a separate product called Matcha, you know, it's very much our company's product, right? It's something we're offering out there for the customers to use. And so we curate, you know, to meet our obligations, right? We think about it in terms of, okay, what are the requirements for us as hosting a UI separate from the protocol, and that has implications, right, as to whether these tokens are securities or, you know, a lot of those issues. And so it's tricky because we think about this at an internal level, and I'm not sure how much the actual general public thinks about that distinction, right? To them, the product is the UI, and so it's one of those things that, you know, I think lawyers probably think about more so than even the average users.
Yeah, just to build on that last point, it's actually something that companies should be thinking about with their lawyers really early, right? To make these distinctions and make a plan. It's sort of, you should think about where you want to end up at the very beginning and work towards that, both on the UI side and on the protocol side.
Yeah, Rebecca, I would actually just add to that, in the development of any type of, honestly, application, you should truly get your different types of stakeholders from the legal, compliance, regulatory, whatever side that you may, you know, sort of like impact. You should get those stakeholders early so that you don't make those mistakes, because nobody wants to reprogram, you know, a whole platform knowing that you know, in the step number 2, you made the mistake that does not, you know, work from regulatory perspective. So that truly applies to anything.
It's true. I think in some good ways, though, with these types of protocols, people are iterating. There's version 1, version 2 of the protocol. And so I will say Marc and I have come in between, you know, version 1 and version 2 or something like that, and have been able to work on mitigating risks and things like that. So I agree, it's always good to start from the beginning, but luckily with these iterations, there's some.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's good to know that you can fix those mistakes, because yeah, I mean, it's better to avoid, but good to know that they can be, you know, also.
And I think too, like, sorry, Ksenia. So
sorry.
Yeah, no. So I feel, you know, these are all important things, and just to add, you know, another layer onto it. Sorry, but the marketing too. You know, how you're thinking about promoting it has become, you know, almost as crucially as important as all these other considerations. Marc or Ksenia, maybe I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I would look at marketing question, and again, I mean, this is not exactly my space, but my space is sort of more of understanding digital assets generally, and how the platforms work and what those assets sort of represent, and depending on what they represent, you may fall within a different kind of regulatory environments, because that's the product. If it's going to be different ways that you would approach it, whether it's a commodity or whether it's a security, right? We know that, you know, we're going to fall within a different jurisdiction. So I think that need to understand, first of all, what is it that their product represents, how it works, how it operates, and then understand what are the various regulatory implications of marketing and getting it out there to the people in a compliant way, basically.
You know, the interesting thing I think about
others.
Go for it.
Go ahead, Marc. I was going to say it's a little tricky because I think the marketing plays into how the asset gets characterized, right? So, you know, I think the concept that we can just identify an asset of like, this is a commodity or this is a security is really tricky based on kind of how the tests are put out there. And in a lot of ways, our legal system depends on what is the legal relationship between the person who's offering this item and buying this item, right? And so, you know, if somebody wraps up a token in, a token deal and basically says, you promise to get a bunch of returns from this and it's going to be great. Well, that package, in marketing looks more like a security than if you just say, hey, I have this token, can I get a piece of, a cup of coffee and accept this, right? And so it's weird that it might be technically the same asset, the wrapper and marketing and stuff that you put around it. And so, and it gets to the point of like, okay, then all of our marketing has to be vetted for this kind of concept of, does it change the overall characterization of these assets?
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
It has to be a faithful. Yeah.
Sorry. No, I was going to just say it's taking the marketing piece from like a different perspective. It's funny to say that DeFi is getting competitive because it's such a small world, but in a way, it's actually getting very competitive with a lot of protocols pushing to do the same thing, and that really, I think has triggered. I think there's always been a push towards the marketing side of things, but I think the marketing side of things has become even more of a focus than it was before, and you've got this tension, I think, from a regulatory perspective, where in a way, that marketing can actually create issues, but in another way, it's like from a business perspective, you're going to have a team who's willing to take more risk on the marketing side than you, driving more interest. And so, what do you do from that perspective? And that's like a tension that we kind of kindly battle with our clients all the time.
Marc reading my internal messages, I think. Yeah.
That's right.
So let's, we only have 30 minutes, and I know each of us could talk for hours and hours on these topics, but I do want to turn to AML and the evolution that we're getting there. AML has been one of the earliest issues that industry and regulators tackled. Of course, when you're dealing with financial services, that's what happens. We've seen blockchain and DLT systems make enormous strides in tackling AML and efficient running systems. Now we're seeing with that evolution the need for consumer protection and consumer privacy. And the two of those, when you think about AML and KYC, know your customer, versus protecting customers and that customer's information and or wallets or anything like that, there's an actual tension there. So I'm just going to throw that out to the group. If someone would like to kind of talk about how we're seeing that interesting tension and how might we think about that playing out in a decentralized environment.
Yeah, I mean, if I may start and others may chime in, I think it's obviously a huge issue in the space, and I think that we're gonna have to think very hard how we develop the technologies in light of the various regulations, and especially on the global basis. I mean, we've got numerous privacy regulations across the globe. Majority of these systems are meant to be operating on a global basis. So how do you program into your particular platform, sort of like ability to comply with those regulations? So I think there's going to be a lot of work from sort of like technology perspective and understanding rules and regulations to be able to comply with, well, first of all, privacy regulations, right? And then we have AML regulations, which also differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So now you're entering a huge other space of rules that you need to comply with, and you need to conform to. But I would like to also add, something, Amy, that you didn't mention, and then something that's near and dear to me, and I think to others in the community, is basically bringing in the unbanked, right? I mean, we are trying to bring in people who are actually not able to go into the traditional financial system and go and open their account for, again, the same reasons. I mean, it's almost, chicken and the egg issue here, but we need to have some smart minds who are able to solve this issue. So if we have refugees who have lost their papers, if we have individuals that may have suffered, natural disaster, or there are numerous other examples that we can think about, how do we bring them in, and how do we get the system and whether it's going to be decentralized and fully decentralized, but how do we get, balance between keeping their privacy, what information do we get from them, but also satisfying the AML requirements. So I think those are the issues that are up in the air, and they're going to be really important to solve if we want to move the the DeFi sort of forward.
And some of that, I think, gets into kind of the authentication problem, and how, when you're talking about inclusion, and how do you confirm that someone is who they say they are, and kind of digital identity solutions, potentially biometrics, or things like that.
I mean, with DeFi, you're in some ways, depending on what the protocol is doing, you're not doing that initial KYC AML, right? Because it's an open system. That's sort of the whole point of it, right? The whole point of DeFi is for financial inclusion. The issue, though, is, do you really want to let, how are you going to think about complying with things like AML, OFAC, and the like? KYC, I think, is not as, relevant, because you're not doing this whole onboarding process. But I think there are a lot of ways and a lot of tools out there that you can at least, that, decentralized protocols and the companies running them or behind them can at least put systems in place to monitor what's happening on chain, and try to comply with these concepts at a high level, even if they can't comply 100% with the letter of the law because it's decentralized.
It's an interesting conundrum, and for those of you that are kind of into the AML weeds, the FATF, which is the multilateral entity that looks at AML, published a report recently, and there's a paragraph in there that talks about the potential to ban or to prohibit the licensing of exchanges that enable peer-to-peer, which I would extend to also potentially decentralized systems. And so, it is something that I think is on the horizon for, I know we at the Chamber are looking at this. I'm sure others will as well, because, that to me should not be the solution, just because we can't figure that out. We have to figure that out.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's like a natural tension right now between, the historical system as it is, and dominated with mainly a reliance on financial intermediaries, right? And so a legal system that makes sense to regulating those intermediaries and asking them to kind of, surveil and keep an eye on potential legal activities, to a one that is, just fundamentally built differently. And so the legal obligations, that legal structure doesn't exactly fit. And the solution, in my mind at least, is kind of understanding that trend, is trying to figure out what is the real risk, seeing if there's a need for change on that front. The solution isn't like, oh, we don't want to give people control over their assets and allow them, access to a peer-to-peer marketplace, because we don't feel equipped to keep an eye on that. And so I think that's where, particularly with groups are on the front edge of the policy stuff, right? Those are the places where the law isn't bad for DeFi right now. FinCEN's guidance makes sense in a lot of ways and is thoughtful, but there's that potential for that to change very quickly. And I think probably a lot of people in the DeFi system aren't even aware of that.
Yeah, and one thing that's funny is when you think about, you've got this layer on top of that, which is, right, DeFi, you've got the projects, most of which are, going to back against having to do any kind of KYC, ML, anything like that. And then you've got crypto users who are going to push back on that. But one goal that everyone, I think generally have is trying to bring in these institutions that we're also trying to displace into that ecosystem, so that it increases liquidity, so that there is more, I guess, kind of a bit of a reputational kind of push there that helps. But they're totally comfortable with KYC and AML, and frankly, they almost want that to be able to participate in DeFi. Obviously, that's being pushed down from a regulatory perspective from the government, but nonetheless, that's what they want to see. And so you almost have this tension of we actually want them to come into this space, but they want to do something and have to do something that we don't really want to implement in the same way. I wouldn't say that projects aren't interested in, stopping, X country from participating in the financial, whatever it might be. But I would say that knowing that how many others that kind of boots out of the system is not something most projects are comfortable with.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, there is something to be said for if you start to ban or prohibit things, people just kind of migrate way offline, and I think you no longer have any finger on the pulse for that reason. So it's something that I think is we're touching on it. You know, we're in the beginning phases of this, but I think it's a serious issue that we're going to have to sort out on both sides.
Yeah, I think as Marc alluded to, I mean, projects are aware that this needs to be addressed in some way, shape, or form, especially if you want to have institutional, more legacy/traditional participants come into the DeFi space. And so people are open to it. It's not going to look exactly the same as it does in a traditional bank. But I think that there are a lot of people out there innovating and also looking to comply as much as possible with regulations so that they can get everybody on board and make DeFi, grow even further. So something Marc and I talk to our clients about a lot.
Yeah, and then one part that's interesting for this conversation is Ethereum hasn't, historically we haven't really had any good kind of privacy solutions in terms of like mixers or anything like that, which we're starting to see on Ethereum. That is going to give kind of an opportunity for privacy that we haven't actually seen on Ethereum historically. And so how that plays into all of this is going to be very interesting, especially with, FinCEN's guidance that I think is very supportive of things like just mixers as software rather than as kind of service providers.
And I think, I think we're getting near our time, but just kind of to point out, and Jason, you raised this earlier, is that banning something is really just a sign of, kind of fear of the unknown, right? Like you just don't understand this yet. And instead, you really need to identify the specific risk, right, that you're trying to manage, and then how do you mitigate each one? Some you can mitigate more, some maybe a little bit less, but you got to figure that out. And so, I think, we're kind of engaged in a pretty highly specialized conversation here. I think education is going to be key, just to getting regulators. I think the understanding in this area is very lumpy.
Right. And I think there's maybe been education when it comes to blockchain and crypto generally, but you have this new level of DeFi and what does it mean and how does it work and how do these protocols interact with blockchain, all of that. And I think that there needs to be a good push towards that earlier in terms of education of regulators earlier rather than later.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree with that, and I salute to so like the various industry groups that are growing these days. I think that we need to, as an industry, have unified and good voices that speak on behalf of the industry with the regulators. Because from what I see, regulators are open for the discussions. They understand that industry participants are trying to do the right thing, and it's hard for the industry to grow without having that guidance, more substantive guidance and regulation from the regulators. So I think that we already seeing some progress. We just need to have more progress, and I think it is also incumbent on the individual companies within the industry to basically raise the issues and keep the conversation going.
No. Great. Well, I think we're at the end of our time, guys. So really enjoyed our conversation and working with you all. You guys, some great minds thinking through these things, and we've clearly got more work to do. For now, thank you, and take care, everyone.
Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.